Welcome to FourSight U. Today, we're delighted to have Josh Mahaney here. He is doing his dissertation research on how to sell ideas and how ideas are taken up or not taken up in organizations. I heard his presentation at the Creativity Expert Exchange this year and thought it was incredibly valuable information and would be really useful for anybody working in creative process, or working in any process at all, frankly. So we thought it would be a good fit for FourSight U, and I will turn it over to him. But let me just say, he is currently a student at the Grenoble École de Management, which is at the foot of the French Alps. And that's why he looks so hale and hearty, because he gets to hike all the time. But Josh, thank you for coming. It's really thrilled that I get to hear this again and that you get to share this with this group.
Thank you. I'm super excited. I'm one of the lucky academics that gets to hear positive feedback about their research and get to share it to more people. So I know there's other people out there where, I don't know, maybe they're hesitant to share, but I mean, any way I can share and help out some practitioners, academics, it's awesome. So thanks for the invitation, and excited to show you guys what I have. Yeah, it's research, guys. So, you know, it's quite academic-y, if that's a word. And
we're fine with that.
We like that word.
If you think it's a word, it's a word.
It's academic crazy, but I'll share the presentation and you know, I'll go through it. Honestly, I don't know what the time constraints are. Last time I had like 45 and I was rapid fire machine gun. So please let me know what we're dealing with here.
What we'll do is we'll do it. We've got an hour officially. And if you finish before then, that'll be great, because there'll be room for questions. We often let people stay on and ask, you know, just follow up with additional questions, but we'll close this at the hour. So.
Okay, like close as in finish the recording, kind of.
Finish the recording, yeah.
Okay, great. All right, well, I will share my screen then. And start from the beginning. Okay, so welcome officially. And I always like to do a shout out to my advisors, Fiona Schweitzer and Thomas Gillier, experts in new product development and creativity, respectively. So this is about how to share ideas. So I usually go around the room, ask a couple people when they're pitching their ideas in their respective contexts, what do they think the best way to present is? Is it incomplete or complete in terms of the idea? Or is it a narrative or non-narrative, meaning do you tell a story or do you kind of just throw it out there, bullet point sort of fashion? So I don't know if people want to participate, throw it out there and let me know what they think.
Well, I'm ready to jump in. So I would use narrative and incomplete.
I would echo that. That's what we're encouraged to do. I can't comment if that's the best way to do it, but that's what we're told to do where I work.
So incomplete and narrative. So tell a story, but don't go over the top. So
leave room for the imagination. Yes.
Yes, I love that. You're jumping to the end of my presentation.
No.
So I'll give you a little detail about what I've done in my research, and really the key question here is there is a distinction between presentation and co-creation, right? So in some cases you may present, some cases you may want to co-create with someone, and that's kind of these are kind of the main questions I looked at for my thing, my research. So there's a quick observation that I want to mention, and I worked at Disney in a couple different capacities. One of which was at Disney Design Group. This is a division that my boss, he formerly worked at, and he told this story. I worked in a different division, and he told this story about how him and his fellow graphic designers would create designs for all the products and all the products, physical products like T-shirts, mugs, and so on you see at the Disney parks and resorts. Now in Disney Design Group, they obviously, there's like a process by which they get it through management, and then ultimately the approvals lead to manufacture. Now the question is, like, how do they get it back past the manager, right? Because they were very, they held their designs very personal and, it was their own expression, but obviously they had to adhere to some guidelines. And he always referred to this joke as of a creative thumbprint. And this idea of a creative thumbprint was the fact that they noticed that their managers would always need to put their own creative sort of interpretation on the designs before they would approve them and move them forward. And this happened so regularly and to such an extent that him and his colleagues would they would actually leave the ideas incomplete, places in which they knew how their manager would complete the idea, and then feel sort of like they owned it and would move it forward, to the next stages. So this notion of creative thumbprint really made me think about some experiments, some tests I could do regarding, the buying of ideas regarding someone's manager. So this is some theory, right? We obviously with research, we start with some theory, we look into what work has been done. Creative ideas, as many of us may know, they're defined in the literature as novel and useful, but to get to innovation, of course, they need to be implemented. It's not just people's ideas. And there's been some qualitative research that pitching ideas and involving, producers, this was the case of a Hollywood film industry, involving the producers and making them feel like they were creating. So this quote, the pitch has to get the catchers, the producers, to participate, to contribute, makes them feel creative, and they buy into the game when they say it. So this idea of getting people in some, even the ones that are there to like promote or to fund your idea, getting them involved in a generative dialogue and feel like they're creating it is actually, could actually be proved fruitful. Some other research in sort of the influence literature shows that there's actually this tactic that often happens called consultation, where using the target or the person from whom you want to gain sort of resources or their attention or something like this, some kind of resource, using them as a platform to present their ideas, but actually showing that you're willing to change your idea based on that person's feedback. So that's the idea of consultation. There is an Academy of Management journal, a very reputable journal experiment where they look at different influence tactics in the context of pitching novel ideas in organizations, but they didn't actually measure the outcome of consultation. So they did proffer sort of this opportunity for a manager to actually build on an idea, but they didn't actually measure the outcome. They didn't see if the manager built on the idea and was more willing to invest in that idea. So this is sort of wants to do some experimental work to find out this question: how can employees influence their managers to gain investment in their idea? So I found this construct of psychological ownership and thought that this was the path maybe through which someone can actually get their manager to buy into the idea, and maybe through the path of owning. So psychological ownership in the literature, it reflects of one's possession. Okay, so early research tied psychological ownership to things like an organization or job, because as with business research, you're really interested in outcomes like how long is someone going to stay, how attached they to their job. But later, this proved to be such an interesting construct, and later research, there really was an advance in looking into psychological ownership through the lens of owning ideas, so more abstract things, and so from a collective standpoint, collectively owning an idea, from an individual standpoint, owning things like arguments and positions. This sort of literature has been moving to more abstract things, and even more recently, there's been some research around digital goods and ownership. So obviously, lots of things are online and digital. I don't really have that here, but that's just very recent research. So there was some research that showed that one could create psychological ownership by just asking a set of questions. So one person trying to get buy-in for trying to get ownership for the idea, they could just ask a set of questions, and they could basically create this ownership in another person. And in addition to that, there may be this idea of incompleteness, right? So the idea of the creative thumbprint and leaving something incomplete so a manager could sort of put their creative thumbprint in that incomplete spot it seemed like it would work naturally with this idea of gaining ownership in an idea. So the way in which I did this, I had some hypotheses, pretty straightforward. So if an employee gets a manager to contribute, then the manager is more likely to invest. That's involvement. That literature has been around for a long time. But this sort of newer piece is, if a manager gets involved with their own creativity, they will have ownership. And this is the reason, this is the mediation behind why they may invest. So it's not just being involved, it's specifically this ownership, the psychological ownership construct. And if there's an idea that actually is more incomplete, a manager will actually be more likely to involve themselves, be more likely to contribute creatively, and have show sort of feelings of greater ownership. So an idea that's incomplete potentially would give the opportunity for a manager to build on an idea more, and thus obviously creating greater ownership. So this is just the model. This is what the sort of theoretical model looks like that we tested. And its idea contribution leads to willingness to invest. But actually, there's this pathway through psychological ownership. Perhaps if a manager contributes to an idea, it's because of psychological ownership that they are willing to invest, not just because they're involved. So I did an experiment, online experiment, and it's a scenario based. So individuals were online. They received a text saying, we did test to make sure that they mostly were managers, but this simulation was, you're in a video game company, you're looking for ideas for a new game, and your employee brings you the idea of an adventure game, and had a description of what the idea was about. And the contribution request had to do with that experiment that I mentioned earlier, where in the experiment, they asked participants to answer a certain number of these three questions, generally these three questions, but I sort of modified them for a video game context. And so they asked them to propose a name, decide on a location for this person in the video game, and identify jobs that character in the video game could do, and just answer sort of those with their ideas that they could possibly. Now the DV was, obviously the mediator was psychological ownership. That's the reason why a manager may invest. And the DV of willingness to invest just comes from, how may a venture capitalist evaluate an opportunity? So what's the probability they might invest? What's the likely amount they may invest, and how successful, right? So it's not just monetary. It's literally like do they believe in the potential of the idea, in addition to how much may they invest in the idea. So I found a significant direct effect, but then I ran the mediation analysis and found that yes, actually, it is a full mediation. So the direct effect no longer exists when you take into account psychological ownership. What does that mean? That means that it is because of psychological ownership that when a manager contributes with their own ideas to that original idea, that they are more willing to invest. It is because they have feelings of ownership for that original idea. So I then ran another experiment, and obviously I would want to change the context to see if this will replicate, but actually this does replicate across different scenarios. And I generated an idea in a short and a sort of more longer or more complete version of a bicycle gadget. And so it's a smart biking device, pretty straightforward technological advice about biking. And the contribution condition was very similar, but reframed in the context of gadgets. So it's add features, decide where it could be mounted, and a marketing campaign to promote what that gadget would be. So this was the condition in which they would contribute. So I did run this analysis again. And so the question is there a direct effect? Yes. The managers that generated ideas were willing to invest more. And then was it mediated by psychological ownership? Yes. Again, the main effect disappeared, meaning it was because of psychological ownership that managers were more likely to want to invest in the idea because they felt like they owned it. And this was dependent on the moderator of complete and incomplete. So, meaning that the less complete idea, the more likely a manager was contributing and feeling ownership for the idea, and therefore the more likely they were willing to invest in that idea. So I have contributions and limitations. As with any good academic, you have to have this at the end. So maybe this is a new strategy to increase probability of idea development or implementation in firms. This is a new DV in psychological ownership literature. So psychological ownership has to do with like willingness to pay or willingness to pay measures or job retention and other things like this. But for us, it was really, we want to know about this evaluation of the potential of an idea and how much a manager was willing to invest. And obviously this consultation idea of getting someone involved it has a clear connection with ownership in the sense that how can you get someone involved and own something to make them invest? But this is something that has been yet underexplored in the research as well. Of course, there's limitations. I don't have a real world setting. As your academic field studies are like the golden standard, or at least one of the standards. So you want to do that if possible. And I tested 2 ideas. So, the context, did I replicate it across contexts? Yes. Are there different contexts and different ways in which an idea may be expressed, and lengths that ideas could be, extended or like retracted? Maybe if it's a 2-word idea, I don't know, maybe that effect doesn't work. You go to your manager and say, hey, I have an idea, it's blue. I don't know, maybe that probably doesn't work. So there are some limitations and boundary conditions that can be explored in future research. And of course, I have ideas about this. This is who I am as an academic, so I could probably talk for hours and hours. And there's territoriality. So this idea of territoriality, I'll get into with the next sort of experiment slash the further work that I did later in my PhD. But territoriality really has to do with protecting and defending your idea. And so this has a theoretical relevance to psychological ownership. It's tied directly to psychological ownership. And I will talk more about that because I did those experiments right now. So this is the second research. Well, it's a set of studies, but it's a second paper that I've been developing. And I actually have a paper under review now where I combined sort of the findings from all of these papers. So I'm willing to talk more about that in the Q&A / interest after. So I also, so obviously Disney Parks and Resorts, we had a vice president there. It's funny how my research comes from just stories from like bosses, but the VP used to be a PR, the VP of the creativity department in which I work, used to be a PR manager. Oh, well, he's a PR VP. But he's famous for, or he liked to tout his success in selling the idea to NASA of getting Buzz Lightyear on the International Space Station. Okay, that was one of his like awesome inventions / things that he got done. And he tells the story about how he kind of sort of replicated in an anecdotal data way. He sort of said, he would ask the NASA engineers, can we get, Buzz Lightyear there? And they're like, no, it doesn't make sense, not feasible. There could be, dirt on it, could totally ruin everything, whatever, infect something, I don't know, but ruin the environment. And eventually he got them to a place where the executives, they're building on the idea, right? And he says in the stories that he tells this story over and over, he knew when they were building on the idea, if we did this, it could look like this. As soon as he got them to that place, they're immediately bought in. And he knew that he would get that. He says that's the moment he knew that Buzz Lightyear would go to space. So that was his claim to fame. And one of the things he did was he employed storytelling in pitching this. So he said, little boys and little girls would be inspired. Can you imagine the future astronauts that we would inspire by just bringing one of their favorite beloved toys into space. I don't know, I'm trying to remember exactly when he pitched this, but he probably didn't realize that like the older people in the room were the little boys and girls when Toy Story came out. But there's a sequel 2 and 3 and so on. So he's probably talking about the sequels. But anyway, you've got this story where he tells a story about how it could be inspiring. And in addition to that, the picture on the right, we would have executives working on innovation projects with us, and we would sort of get them involved, of course, co-creation, and they would become champions of the idea. But when it came to the senior executives that would come in at the very end of the of the project, we would then take them through the journey. We would tell them a story of what we did. Okay, so this is how we generated the ideas. This is how we're looking at implementing them. Here is all the data that we collected and so on. And so I was really curious, okay, if an idea that's incomplete generates more ownership and investment, then what about storytelling? Like, isn't this like kind of counterintuitive to like the whole idea of like leaving something? And sort of we alluded to that in the beginning when people said, yeah, leave it maybe incomplete, but tell a story. So I wanted to investigate this. And I was interested in idea champions, because idea champions are really the people that they leverage informal relationships within organizations. For our case, we were innovation sort of consultants internally, but our relationship was still informal. We didn't lie. We weren't in their business unit, and we weren't there to convince them of anything. But we did have ideas that were generated by the team, and so the idea is getting these informal relationships to buy into to ideas. And so sometimes this, there's different levels of formality, but either way, innovation champions or idea champions use multiple influence tactics to gain support. But in terms of consultation, of course, as I mentioned before, this has been underexplored in the context of psychological ownership. And so essentially, the point of idea champions is presenting an idea and gaining commitment. So I really wanted to look into the lens of commitment in this research, because really when it comes to internal politics, you want to basically get people on board. You want people to join the team, or at least are willing to commit to the idea and work on it at least a little bit in order to make it sort of more, more prevalent throughout the organization. People use the word socialize it, like to socialize it. People will talk about it more. And then eventually when it gets to top management, maybe they're more likely to implement or put some more significant resources toward it. So, so there's some issue selling literature that talked about packaging. It's a form of presentation is key to gaining commitment for issues in organizations or ideas. So commitment is a key construct of both theory and relevant to championing ideas successfully. And there is some research that shows that presenting ideas and narratives can stimulate mental imagery. It can transport people. But however, we've got this idea, the findings from this earlier research, that presenting ideas and soliciting others to contribute to them stimulates psychological ownership, or this feeling that something is owned by you. Commitment and psychological ownership have also been theoretically connected. So I have this connection in the theory as well. So really had the nice platform during which I could just run this research. But in addition to that, there's this negative consequence of psychological ownership that also exists in the theory called territoriality. So if psychological ownership is something I own, right? It's this is mine. Right? Even in the literature, they say, in quotes, "it's mine" to describe psychological ownership. What territoriality is something that's quote unquote not yours. So being territorial is taking actions to maintain attachment to an object, considered a downside psychological ownership. In a way, you can think of territoriality in sort of like two main buckets. It's protecting what you own and defending what you own, right? So this is the main experimental model that I wanted to test. I wanted to see if idea contribution did lead to psychological ownership, which does that lead to territoriality, which in the literature, territoriality does lead to more commitment. So On the plus side, if you're more territorial about something, you're more likely to commit more toward it. On the downside, there's some behavioral outcomes of territoriality that are negative. So the first experiment, I did have a colleague bring sort of the participant who are innovation managers an idea. And I don't have the scenarios here. There are several different ideas in technological domain to see if them contributing to an idea would lead to ownership and idea commitment, which is very similar to the model that you guys saw in my first couple experiments. Obviously, the DV is a little different. It's not investment, it's commitment. But the idea contribution scenario, how we asked people to contribute to the original idea, is very similar. So I found this, I replicated this effect, this idea that yes, contributing to an idea leads to commitment. It's dependent upon, or I mean, it's because of psychological ownership. Now I wanted to test territoriality. So I had a new scenario, a new situation. And I found that while idea contribution leads to psychological ownership that leads to commitment, also contributing to an idea leads to psychological ownership, which leads to territoriality. There is no direct connection between territoriality and commitment. So what this means is if someone is more territorial about an idea, they're not necessarily more committed to it, right? But if they have psychological ownership for an idea, then they are usually more territorial, okay? And then I wanted to look at this boundary condition of narratives. In the subsequent experiments I did, we didn't really have an association between narratives and ownership. So you would think that like contributing to sort of an idea that's in a story versus not a story may have an impact on how much someone might own that idea. But in fact, we didn't find this in this research. So what does that mean is we did find that when if someone contributes to an idea, they're less likely, that's a narrative, they're less likely to commit to it, okay? So if someone contributes to a non-narrative, so something that's not a story, they're more likely to commit to it. But this is not because of their ownership. There may be some other reasons, some other mediation, some other causes why this is the case. But we did find that if in just a presentation situation, so if a colleague is just presenting an idea, not asking for their manager's contribution, we find some marginal evidence that actually showing a story, telling a story is better. So if you do tell a story, from my results perspective, you more and more likely to solicit commitments for someone versus not telling a story, which is pretty intuitive. Yeah, so this is essentially like the graph. Essentially, if no one contributes, they're more likely to want to invest in a narrative versus if they contribute. This is the part that's sort of counterintuitive. If someone if someone contributed to an idea that was in a story, they're less likely to want to commit to it. So if I see a story and people are like, are you committed to this idea? Absolutely, yes, I would love to work on this more. I see a lot of potential. But if someone brings me an idea that's a story and they say, hey, I would love your ideas for it, and ask me to commit to, or ask me to contribute those ideas, and then later ask me, hey, do you want to work on this more? Do you see the potential? It's actually a backfire effect. I'm less likely to want to work on that idea. So why is that? This is all questions that I had, and I looked at for future research. Now, I really want to go over the contributions of this paper kind of a little bit, but I also want to tell you some of the new research that I've been doing literally in the last months to tie this all together in a bow. So there is a lack of research and idea championing. If you noticed, I can go back to like the real business literature, like the very top journals, when it comes to the process of ideas, it's starting to look very much like the process of creative problem solving, or sort of the FourSight profiles that reflect this creative problem solving process. I'll just go back to it quite quickly because it's interesting. If you see the stages, it starts with generation, and then elaboration, and then championing, and then implementation. And championing is really like looking out for the resources that people can support you. And then implementation, of course, is making the plan happen. So generation, elaboration, championing, and implementation. This is key in organizations because it's important to have a champion that is willing to sort of push that. I know a lot of times in creative problem solving, you have this, you're solving a problem that you have influence over, but in organizations, often you don't have influence. You need to gather those resources before it can be implemented. So that's why it's a key change in the process of creativity. So unfortunately, though, there is a lack of research in this idea championing phase. And these cognitive antecedents, we have behavioral things. We have influence tactics, ways in which people engage in impression management with managers to sort of sell ideas. That's there. But what are the cognitive reasons behind why a manager may or may not choose to commit on an idea or invest in an idea? This is very much, unfortunately, under-researched. And so this kind of extends research in this phase of the idea journey and connects it to these influence theories, most notably consultation, where you're getting someone involved and asking for their change in the idea and showing you're open to their feedback. And of course, psychological ownership, which is the cognitive mechanism that I explore most notably. And it's key to understanding why getting someone to contribute to an idea, may be helpful and may facilitate them to own it and of course subsequently want to invest in it more. In addition to that, we have this dark side of gaining commitment. So this is not fully explored, and some of this early experiments do tie psychological ownership with territoriality, a dark side of psychological ownership, and so it should be considered. So in practical considerations, you obviously want to think about what are the things that when you're trying to get someone to co-create with you, what's their sort of agenda items? Where do you think they're going to take that idea, and what kind of person are they? Are they very egotistical? Are they a person that they're prone to hiding their ideas and defending them, or are they highly collaborative? Are they a very collaborative person? So if they have some ownership for it, they're sort of this behavioral idea of territoriality. It may not be exhibited with them so much because their personality, who they are, they're more likely to be more altruistic when it comes to the ideas that they share with others or share with you. And so obviously this contributes to theory on narratives. So narratives have shown to facilitate customer engagement and actually make people want to commit more. But this does show this downside of narratives. It shows this backfiring effect when you're trying to sell an idea and you're trying to get someone involved and actually get them to psychologically own an idea. This idea of a narrative may not be the best. Actually, they might be less likely to want to commit to an idea if you're getting them to co-create something that looks like a cohesive story that's super complete, that's inspiring, but doesn't really have a place in which they feel like they can put their creative thumbprint. And so obviously, overall, this research provides idea champions effective strategies of pitching ideas. But this, honestly, this is in the literature shows that idea champions are people with resources. But what we're arguing in our research is something a little more subtle. We're trying to say that if you can actually use different ways in which you can get people on board and you can get their political support, then maybe idea champions can come from anywhere, right? So obviously something that a lot of us, whether it's individuals trained in FourSight or trying to practitioners of creative problem solving, it's all about the fact that creativity can come from anyone. And so this is kind of reinforcing that idea with regard to champions. You don't need to be someone on the high castle to sort of give resources. This is a technique in which someone can have the capacity to not only generate, but also sell ideas effectively just using their creative capacity. So that's it for me. There's some limitations in future research that are basically very similar to what I had in the first experiments. So obviously, real world settings are always helpful, and your feedback is very helpful and hearing people's stories in corporate, because of course, it's the real world, right? It's what happens on a day-to-day basis. These are simulation studies, and this is what happens when participants are expressing their ideas, maybe in the privacy of their own home, or they're simulating an idea. And so they may be in a space where they can be more creative. And so that, yes, they might have more ownership in ideas, or they may be more territorial and be more likely to defend an idea that they create in the privacy of their own home, right? You feel some more ownership for things when you're at home than maybe when you're at work. But this is obviously areas for new research. And just to confirm my sort of the offer that I made in the middle of the presentation about the future research. So we did find that we are looking at narratives and incompleteness on psychological ownership. So we wanted to see if actually these two impact each other with regard to getting someone to own an idea and the tendency of them to invest or commit in the idea. And we find that, yes, when you actually compare ideas in an incomplete and in a non-narrative form, they are actually more likely, managers or individuals, colleagues, and organizations are more likely to own the idea. They're more significantly likely to own the idea and commit to that idea and believe in its potential more. So it's not an if, it's more of an and question. If you want to present an idea, we found, and get their ownership, it needs to be both incomplete and non-narrative. So that's sort of the secret sauce and some of the new research we've been doing in the last few months. And hopefully, we're successful with the journal article that it's under revision right now. But in either case, sort of that's what we found. So to answer the provocative question, it depends. Obviously, that's always the answer. It depends. But if you're presenting an idea, it's probably better to ask for contribution. But if you're asking, obviously, it's better to use a non-narrative and a less complete idea. So in cases where you can sort of create that whole and let the manager or that colleague put their creative thumbprint in there, maybe they're very, they have low self-confidence. Maybe they don't feel like they're that creative. Maybe this is a great opportunity for you to creatively collaborate with someone that hasn't had that creative success before in their life. So either way, whether or not you're gaining their commitment, you may make a positive emotional connection with that individual, regardless. So if you're asking for contribution, maybe it's best to do both. Maybe it is best to sort of, defer your completeness tolerance for premature closure and do that to the benefit of your idea, right? So you have this idea, you want it to be successful in your organization. Maybe it's best for you to just try not to tie every bow, and shine it so it's super shiny and polished, just because other people want to work on it. They're there with their creativity, and it's going to benefit the ultimate success of your idea, maybe. So that's all I got.
That is great
And
stuff.
thank you so much.
That is great stuff. And I'm sure people have lots of questions. I know I have some questions, but I will let the crowd, I'll defer to anyone who's got an immediate question. Just raise your hand and take yourself off mute.
Just to get a high level framing, Josh, are these pre-studies to the work you're doing on your dissertation, or is this all studies leading up to your dissertation? What are we looking at?
Sure. So the slides that began with the creative thumbprint and led up to the Buzz Lightyear story regarding managers and investment was my first year paper. I'm doing a three paper dissertation model.
Oh, perfect.
And
perfect.
Yeah, and the second paper is sort of everything after Buzz Lightyear. So it's about commitment, territoriality, and this idea of like narratives, non-narratives, incomplete, complete, and does that have an effect on ownership? Which we find it does. You need both sort of to gain ownership. My third year paper, even though I'm almost approaching the final year of my PhD, is under development. So it's under construction. It has to do with, you know, different, if you're interested, different types of fiction, whether it's science fiction, sort of more like interesting narrative versus sort of the facts of the matter regarding new technologies in your organization, and adoption or sharing as the DV. So, and the mediators have to do with creativity. So, you know, it's almost like how can you best present ideas that you need bought into the organization, and how can you get it so that, how can you get them bought in through people's creativity by actually having people co-create with you. So it's sort of in line with some of the stuff I've been doing.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks. That's really helpful to sort of see where the puzzle pieces fit and what the through line is on that research. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's everything you've seen today is the journal article that's under review, and you know, may or may not get me a job. So fingers crossed on that one.
Absolutely. In terms of level of commitment, you talked about that. That's possibly important. What did you account for that, or do you have thoughts on how to account from that? Is from, you know, do I just need you to not resist my idea, to I need your agreement to actively support the idea, or, you know, is there a difference there, or a thought of how you could look at that?
Sure. So essentially, you know, we want to make sure there's a meaningful difference between the situations. So whether someone contributes or not, whether someone is exposed to a non-narrative, narrative, incomplete, complete, you know, and there are significant differences. And regarding the framing of commitment, it is more of like it's less a behavioral measure and more of an intention. So the way we're measuring it is someone's intention to work on it more. They feel like it's a valuable idea to shoot for. They're willing to work on it. They think it would be successful. Like this kind of commitment. This is the way it's conceptualized in those experiments, in those later experiments.
Excellent.
I don't know if I answered that correctly or
Yeah. No, that's helpful. It's it leads to a lot of questions. I mean, it's a wonderful area of that you're studying.
It looks like Clay also has a question.
Yeah. Thanks, Josh, for the presentation. So in the world of PowerPoint and presentation decks and stuff, what qualifies as a narrative? So what would be maybe a narrative, or what wouldn't be, as someone's presenting or pitching an idea?
Sure. So in my experiments, essentially what I looked at was, you know, is there a character in the story? So in your case, maybe if it's a technological situation, is there a user sort of using the product? Are you showing them use a product? And is there a sequence of events? So is there a way that they're introduced to the product? Are they going through the uses of that, and how are they actually using it? Are there actions, verbs used? And is there kind of like an outcome at the end? How successful are they with that product? So it's almost like character, a flow of a story, beginning, middle, end. That would be sort of the way that you conceptualize it. Now with a non-narrative, you have sort of, imagine bullet points, and it's more of like a, you know, it's a sort of, you're just making a descriptive offering. So this is possible. This is possible. Maybe you can use the word user, but you're not really identifying anyone. You're kind of like leaving it up to the imagination of the viewer, of the reader. And actually, there's some research. I'm trying to remember it off the cuff exactly, but I'm gonna like paraphrase it, maybe get it wrong, but essentially, when trying to show sort of get managers in the empathetic place to understand another a person or like how another user may use a product, there's actually a backfiring effect, and managers will reflexively go back and further reinforce their own ego and really like be more focused on themselves, right? So it's possible that this is affecting why, you know, telling a story with a user may be not a good idea, because you have an executive who's there who wants to fill in the story with their own idea or their own sort of actions, and you're kind of disallowing them to do that because you're already creating a character that is using it that's outside of their sphere of influence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so this feels very kind of, I know, design thinking kind of, I mean, because like, at least where I work, the consumer is the center of everything, right? So you're always
Right.
telling things from the frame of a consumer experience or how they would use the product, right? You know, there's always an expectation of feedback, you know, too, when you're presenting the things. So it's, yeah, it's kind of interesting to kind of wrap my head around all of this.
I think the key, I mean, obviously there's a lot of limitations when you do these kinds of experiments in research for sure. And that's like, I feel like I'm swimming in a world of exceptions and potential issues and so on. But in terms of my experience of like looking at that, yeah, I mean, essentially, I would say it's a lot of it has to do with how you frame the feedback, right? So if you're what you're kind of like, I know I can almost imagine your head, right? You're watching yourself present, and you're kind of getting stuck. There's all these things. Okay, I can't do it there. And for me, it's almost like some of these things are answered by the way I did the experiment design that I can't express completely in like a short amount of time. But others are totally ambiguous, and I would have to say I don't know. So my I don't know is like 99% of it. But regarding your sort of inferred question about the feedback, because you always expect the kind of feedback, if you can get someone to a place where you can guide their feedback to be generative, and you can ask them questions regarding something that the idea doesn't offer but clearly needs, that doesn't have to do with an evaluation, I would say you're on the right track. You know what I mean? So so I feel like that's a lot of reasons why some people try to get executives and so in a space of being more playful and like that like alpha brain state when they do these improv activities. You know, I don't think it's just so they like laugh. I think it's literally so that they're in a place where they can be more suggested to co-create and not be evaluating, because obviously that's what they do on a daily basis, on a minute basis. And so that's like the key, right? Like it's almost like, how do you get them in that mindset? And then when you can, they might be more suggestible to questions and proffers of feedback that don't have to do with evaluation. And once you get to that point, just like the story with the Buzz Lightyear, right? These technical people were saying this is not possible. You know, you're going to like, you know, infect our spaceship, to the point where they're saying, well, if it happened, maybe we could do this. And how that transition, you know, that's not really what I researched, but that's a key piece to keep in mind, I would say. Yeah.
Okay. Cool, thanks.
Gosh, it almost sounds like the non-narrative is the equivalent of the how might approach. So you're trying to get them in their heads to say, how might we do this thing? Because we're not preloading it with a narrative. We're not preloading it with too many details. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it's really cool because with the how might we, right, you're making a suggestion. So the question is there, but there's always a way to put together the how might we, right? You have the invitational stem, and then you have that piece that's like, there's a little bit of context in there, right? And sort of like those are like, if you take those as puzzle pieces, they're sort of the puzzle pieces that were involved in the experiments that I ran. So just, you know, as an analogy. So the puzzle piece for the how might we is the question, the suggestion. It invites creativity, innovation, imagination, and you need some specific pieces, like little pieces of context. So it's like, you know, sticky. So people are like, okay, I kind of know where you're going, but I want to answer it now with a lot of ideas. So to use that analogy with my experimental design, what we did is we provided in a non-narrative those little pieces of context that were necessary to grab onto. And then in the contribution request, when we asked for ideas, we then sort of said, okay, well, here are the suggestions of, or here are the questions that we would like suggestions for. So it's almost like the two pieces of the puzzle of the how might we sort of put together.
Josh,
So
in
we're
the,
allowing people to create the how might we, right? It's in a way, I mean, like you said.
in your experiment, you actually did, I remember you wrote it down, but didn't necessarily say it out loud in this presentation. So you asked in that video game specifically, like what kind of contributions did you ask for in your experiment?
Yeah, so it depends. Like there's different things you can ask for the video game. I think it was like name some plot points. I asked them for like if you could. Let me see. So this one was name for the video game, qualities the name would embody. That's one of them. Usually you kind of leave out the identification of the idea itself. Does that make sense? And the location, so that kind of changes, like location in which the video game exists, but it's almost like you want to offer the opportunity for them to give some context and provide the justification. That's like a second one that in general, the really small pieces. And then this third one, identify and describe different jobs. I think one of them was like, it varies just a little. So one of them was, for example, identify a celebrity that could market, or give a celebrity that could market it, and identify ways in which that celebrity would market the idea, right? So in some creative problem solving sessions, you may do that thing where you like imagine a celebrity and how might they sort of come up with ideas, and it really helps you to put yourself in their shoes regarding like more ideas, and it's something very similar to that.
In some ways, it's interesting to hear you talk about that because, the sequence that you laid out to generate ideas, to elaborate the ideas and find the idea champion, and then implement. It sounds like you're really asking to bring the idea champion before you generate ideas and elaborate them. I mean, like the champion ends up, or maybe that's a second round through the second pass through the process where you're bringing that person in.
Yeah, so if I understand you correctly, it sounds like what you're saying is, it sounds like what an idea champion might be doing is going back to the beginning of the creative process, right? And I think that's really important. Like, I think it's almost like every stage there is a creative process that kind of goes again, right? It's like circles within circles, like turtles all the way down, if you will, or CPS all the way down. And yeah, I think like we all engage in this creative process all the time. So this is like, I think the best way to describe it is, yes, of course, in every stage of the CPS process, you could say, hey, some of the things I'm doing sounds like the earlier sort of stages, right? And that's why, like for CPS, you kind of are able to like diagnose the situation and always go back if you want to, right? So if you've gone through the process enough, you can say, okay, yeah, this sounds like something that we've done or that we're going back to. That means you're still doing the process right. But I think the key takeaway, well, not key takeaway, but one interesting thing that this does is, in the literature, the idea championing phase, they don't really talk about generation. They're always talking about a pitch and then a yes or no, a clearance, a political support situation. And here I'm kind of showing that this idea of generation and evaluation exists in all stages, right? So here, even when you're pitching an idea, maybe it's more successful if you involve the creative process, AKA you involve divergence and convergence, and not just give something and see if there's a yes, no, go, no, go situation.
You know, as you're saying that, and as I've been listening to you, I'm going back to good old Alex and Sid, who, they didn't call it implementation. They called that last step acceptance finding. And that's, actually doing the mechanics of manifesting the idea was outside of process. That last step was genuinely gaining acceptance. And if I use that determination a lot of what you're talking about is the magnifying glass on how do we get acceptance? Like, run it through, run the whole process.
Yeah, and I mentioned that like sometimes these senior executives in some of these projects, like the executives would go through the process, but the senior executives, we would take them through the story. But whenever possible, if even a senior vice president, if we could, we would get them involved in the very beginning and the end and have them go through a tool that we have, some fun, playful tool that we had to get them like laughing and generating with us, because it made such a huge impact. Even if they were only available for an hour at the beginning and another hour at the end, in addition to the time that it took for us to take them through the story of the project, then we could actually get them to co-create when there isn't much to co-create, but they're still generating, and they were just much bigger, champions of the project.
That
And
is,
so they're more accepting, yeah.
this is such a fantastic conversation. I want to honor that we have hit our 2 o'clock mark and say, Josh, this was fabulous, and just everything I'd hoped we'd get to do, to listen to what you've done, what you're discovering. And there's obviously a lot more to unpack about the implications this has for, bringing people into the creative process, selling people ideas, but also, there's a whole world of conversation we could have about what is the impact of FourSight preferences on these conversations, and is that nuance something that we could layer on? But right now, I'd like to thank you from everybody at FourSight U for doing this, and we will stay on the call after this. But thanks, Josh. This was a tremendous presentation.
Thank you for the invitation. It was super cool to share with everyone.